Welcome to Have You Read It, the channel where we bring books to life, one summary at a time. Today we're diving into Dahlia Scheindlin's The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel. Promise Unfulfilled. This book isn't just another historical account. It's a critical examination of Israel's complex and often contradictory relationship with democracy, from its pre-state Zionist roots to the tumultuous present. Scheindlin meticulously dissects how Israel has embraced and simultaneously undermined democratic principles throughout its history, offering a sobering assessment of its current state and a call for a more honest reckoning with its past. The book challenges the conventional narrative of Israel as a vibrant democracy, or the only democracy in the Middle East. These narratives, Scheindlin argues, obscure the deeper, more problematic aspects of Israel's democratic experiment. By focusing solely on formal procedures like elections and free press, these narratives ignore the structural inequalities and undemocratic practices that have been woven into the fabric of Israeli society since its inception. The book argues that true democracy cannot exist when it applies only to some and not others. Scheindlin traces the origins of these issues back to the pre-state Zionist movement. While early Zionists adopted certain democratic practices, their primary focus was on establishing a Jewish state, often at the expense of democratic ideals. Theodor Herzl, a key figure in early Zionism, even expressed a preference for an aristocratic republic, fearing that majority rule would threaten Jewish interests. Labor Zionism, which eventually came to dominate the movement, prioritized state building and a Jewish nationalist ethos, often instrumentalizing democracy rather than embracing it as a core value. This instrumental approach to democracy carried over into the early decades of statehood, a period Scheindlin characterizes as Israel's least democratic. Despite the vibrant multi-party system and universal suffrage, the reality was one of highly centralized power, limited civil liberties, and a military regime governing much of the Arab Palestinian population within Israel. Ben-Gurion, the dominant figure of this era, prioritized state building above all else, expressing skepticism towards a formal constitution and a Bill of Rights. The book argues that the lack of a constitution, while partly due to disagreements with religious parties, also reflected a reluctance to enshrine full equality for all citizens, particularly Palestinian Arabs. The absence of these fundamental legal anchors created a void that allowed for ongoing discrimination and selective enforcement of the law, setting a precedent for future abuses. Quasi-governmental institutions like the Histadrut, the powerful labor federation, further consolidated power in the hands of the ruling Mapai party, blurring the lines between state and party. The Histadrut's control over essential services, particularly healthcare, created a system of political patronage that undermined genuine electoral choice. These early decades, the book argues, were marked by significant restrictions on civil liberties, including freedom of movement, freedom of the press, and labor rights, along with episodes of political violence and a culture of secrecy within the state apparatus. The military regime governing Arab citizens during this time exemplified the state's willingness to sacrifice democratic principles for the sake of maintaining a Jewish majority and consolidating power. The period from 1967 to 1992, described as Israel's democratic adolescence, saw a complex interplay of progress and setbacks. The end of military rule over Arab citizens and the emergence of a more assertive judiciary and civil society signaled a potential for greater democratization. However, the 1967 war and the subsequent occupation of Palestinian territories introduced a new set of challenges. The occupation, the sources suggest, not only violated international law and Palestinian rights, but also eroded democratic norms within Israel. The settlement project, in particular, created a system of structural inequality and further blurred the lines between Israel and the occupied territories, making a two-state solution increasingly difficult. Despite the occupation's shadow, Israel experienced certain democratizing trends during this period. The 1977 election marked the first transition of power, breaking Mapai's long-standing dominance. Civil society organizations, including Peace Now and groups advocating for human and civil rights, gained prominence, challenging the government and raising awareness of the occupation's corrosive effects. The judiciary, too, played a more active role, holding the government accountable in certain high-profile corruption cases and expanding the scope of judicial review. The 1990s represented a period of significant, though ultimately unfulfilled, liberal potential. The passage of two basic laws in 1992, enshrining fundamental human rights, signaled a shift towards a more liberal constitutional culture. The Oslo Accords, while ultimately failing to achieve a lasting peace, created a horizon for a two-state solution and temporarily reduced tensions. This era saw social liberalization across various domains, from greater gender equality and LGBTQ rights to a more diverse and independent media landscape and the passage of a Freedom of Information law. However, the seeds of a backlash were also sown during this time. The religious right and pro-settler movements increasingly viewed the Supreme Court and liberal civil society groups as obstacles to their goals. The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995 by a right-wing extremist opposed to the Oslo Accords tragically highlighted the fragility of the peace process and the growing polarization within Israeli society. The failure of the Oslo Accords and the resurgence of violence in the Second Intifada further undermined public support for a two-state solution, creating fertile ground for the rise of a new illiberal right. The period from 2009 to the present has been marked by a steady erosion of democratic norms. Netanyahu's return to power in 2009 coincided with the rise of populist, illiberal forces within Israel, fueled by nationalist sentiment, economic anxieties, and the ongoing conflict. The book highlights the role of figures like Avigdor Lieberman, whose Yisrael Beitainu party openly targeted Arab citizens, in mainstreaming a more explicitly anti-Arab, anti-liberal rhetoric. The Knesset, under Netanyahu's leadership, passed a series of laws targeting civil society groups critical of the government, further restricting freedom of expression and entrenching the unequal status of Palestinian citizens. The nation-state law of 2018, declaring Israel the nation-state of the Jewish people, formalized the privileged status of Jews over other citizens, deepening the already existing inequalities. The ongoing assault on the judiciary, culminating in the 2023 Judicial Overhaul Plan, represents a direct attack on the separation of powers and the rule of law. These developments, the sources argue, reflect a broader trend of democratic backsliding, in which the pursuit of a Jewish nationalist agenda has taken precedence over democratic principles. Scheindlin concludes that Israel's current democratic crisis is not an aberration, but a culmination of its long and complicated history with democracy. The unresolved dilemmas of its founding, the lack of a formal constitution, the privileged status of Jewish identity, and the ongoing control over Palestinians, continue to shape its present. Thanks for watching. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next book dive.